Today we're joined by Adam. He's a postgraduate student studying classics. Adam, thanks for joining us. Yeah, so let's start with, just if you could give a brief overview of your research and sort of what got you into it.
Okay, so I'm going to be looking at the concept of laughter in a work called the Satyrica, which is from classical antiquity by someone called Petronius. In terms of what got me into it, I guess the crudity, the kind of filth of classical literature is something that I've found quite hard to ignore. I've always enjoyed kind of comic texts and sort of vulgarity, I guess. Not to kind of overdo the vulgarity aspect of it, but that's kind of what led me in, and that's what drove me towards classics. In the beginning, I would say it was a kind of desire to get more to grips with that text. Sorry, go on.
So, when you say looking at laughter in the Satyrica, in what sort of context is it sort of understanding laughter within Satyrica? Is Satyrica very like humorous sort of text?
Okay. So why don't I give you a sort of brief overview of the Satyrica itself, and then I can maybe try to answer that question, but I can't make any promises because it's it's a very hard thing to explain. Okay, so the Satyrica, where do I begin? It's written by a guy called Petronius, as I said, who we don't really know that much about, to be honest with you. He appears in the annals of Tacitus. He writes this eulogy of some guy called Petronius Arbiter, right? And the reason we think that he is the Petronius of the Satyrica is that some of the details of this guy's life seem to kind of overlap with some of the details of the text itself. So basically he's described as the arbiter elegentiae, which we don't really know what it means. If you want to put that into like kind of modern parlance, if you want to sort of pick like a British office of state that kind of aligns with, it would be like the Minister for Culture. So sort of like what Nadine Dorries was doing before. And he basically in this kind of eulogy, it says that Nero, who was the emperor, the court that he was working in, would not see anything as intelligent or kind of artistically relevant unless Petronius himself thought so. So this guy was quite influential in that sense. But it's also said that he succeeded by being lazy rather than by working hard. And he was a kind of, I think it uses the word voluptuary, and you kind of imagine a sort of someone who's perfected the art of like coasting, I guess. And anyway, he is basically he ends up being a victim in an intrigue within this court, and he's about to be arrested. So before then, he kills himself by like opening his veins and then binding them up again, and then sort of having a dinner with his friends and family, and sort of like gradually sort of fading away as if he's just falling asleep. And this happens in the Bay of Naples, which is, it seems, where the story as we have it of the Satyrica is actually set. So the story itself, it's been argued successfully that it's basically a kind of parody of the Odyssey, which is the story of Odysseus's return from the Trojan War. He fights the Trojan War for 10 years, and then he takes another 10 years to come home. And he's trying to get to his wife, who is sort of chastely waiting for him. There are a crowd of suitors invading his house and eating all of his livestock, and they're trying to get his, compete for the hand of his wife because they're under the impression that he's died. But she's a good wife and she hangs on for him. And he is going through all of these challenges to try and get home. So it's a story which is, it's serious, and it's kind of not a celebration really, a kind of, it's like a sort of moral text about like traditional Greek virtues and honors and so on. And the Satyrica is a kind of parody of this, because rather than the story of a hero trying to get back to his wife, what you actually have is a trio of guys who are all basically having sex with each other and sort of dossing about the south of Italy, getting into all kinds of like trivial scrapes and sort of robbing people, and they're just taking what they can, basically.
Which sounds very similar to the Odyssey. So yeah, that's right.
Yeah, in a manner of speaking, I guess.
Yeah.
So then, okay, you've got the narrator. His name is Encolpius, and this means basically something like "in the crotch" in Latin. And then you have his love rival, a guy called Ascyltus. And I don't know if you watch football, Sean, but something that annoys me about modern football punditry is this. They often now describe players who've had a really good game as unplayable. I don't know what it means. It's a meaningless phrase. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But if you want to describe Ascyltus in the same terms, you would describe him as unshaggable, okay? Because his name means something like unshagged out. It's literally kind of like sexually insatiable. And just in case you hadn't already pictured this, he has a massive penis, okay? And that is relevant to the story.
Right.
And then they have this third guy's name is Giton, which means like mate. And this guy, it's kind of like a moment where we can comprehend where our own, how would you say, our own kind of morals and customs about sexual activity in the 21st century West clash with those of the Romans, because this Giton, he is very sexually active. He is playing the two other characters off against each other. He knows that they both like him. He's also having sex with loads of other people, and he's very beautiful, it seems, according to the text. But I think he's about 15, right? So he's a young boy, basically. Mm-hmm. And yeah, they just kind of hot-foot it around Italy, basically, and they sort of get into trouble and get out of trouble. And the clash comes from the fact that, okay, you've got, on the one hand, you've got the Odyssey with these like serious kind of kind of philosophically important morals and things, and then on this side you've got like a kind of parody of that story where it's a trio of bisexual guys who are very melodramatic and histrionic and kind of, pretending to be so upset by things that they'll then try to kill themselves, or like it's just a very over dramatic story, which is kind of flying in the face of the seriousness of the Odyssey.
Right. Then in your research, do you sort of refer a lot to that comparison between the Odyssey and the Satyrica? Is that sort of where some of your interest of the humor comes in, or is it more focused on the Satyrica?
It is relevant to the humor, just because it is kind of that's a kind of engine for a lot of the comedy, obviously. But it's not something I'm specifically focusing on. I think just mainly because that's already a kind of generally accepted idea. It's not something that I can maybe get that much out of at the moment. But I'll definitely come to sort of where my specific interests lie in just a moment. But one thing I would also just add to my description of the story is, you've got a kind of, I guess, a kind of divine element to it as well. So Odysseus is being hounded by Poseidon, who's like obviously a very powerful god of the sea with the capacity to do a huge amount of damage, and certainly someone to be feared. And he makes life difficult for Odysseus on his way home. And then in the Satyrica, instead of a god like that, what you have is Priapus, who is dogging the main character, Encolpius. Have you ever encountered Priapus before, Sean?
I haven't encountered a Priapus.
Okay, I would really strongly advise you not to Google image search Priapus on like a work computer.
Right.
Because he is basically like a sort of very malformed man with an absolutely enormous penis. Okay, and
Everyone's just going and searching them up right now.
yeah, just be careful. Anyone who's listening to this who has decided to go and search him up now, you just pick your moment wisely. And yeah, the Romans used to put him in, like, statues of him in like vegetable patches and things, because he was a god of the fertility of animals and vegetables, as well as like male virility. And the implication is that, you know, if you steal some of those vegetables under the eye of Priapus, then he's going to sort of like interfere with you sexually, let's say. Okay, there's a pretty obvious threat there with this this massive member that he has. So it kind of, I mean, we might look at that as a comical thing. Perhaps the Romans did too, but there's also like a threatening side of it there. So in the story, where this kind of manifests itself is that you know, a lot of the sexual activity that the main character Encolpius is trying to engage in is like stifled or kind of thwarted. He can't perform, and it's because Priapus is sort of like you know, blocking him essentially.
Right.
And he's often talking to, so Encolpius is often talking to his own penis as though it were some sort of extra being that is attached to him that is not playing the game, and he's trying to make it work, but it's not happening for him, basically.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess that's the sort of that's a good summary of the sort of the lie of the land, as it were. The most famous part of the Satyrica is excuse me, would be an episode called Trimalchio's Feast. The thing about the Satyrica is that we don't really have that much of the original text surviving. It's estimated that we only have about 10% of it, and we already have like, I don't know, like 150, 200 pages in English. So if that's true, then you know, this thing would have been massive. Yeah. And the other thing is that, you know, just because, like anything else from the classical world, it's a manuscript tradition that we're working from here. So there are quite a lot of gaps in the narrative. Often it's not clear why certain things are actually happening because you're missing the context. You know, like at one point you fade back into the story and it's evident that the narrator's character has murdered someone and he's like on the lam, basically, but you don't know any of the details. You just know that it's kind of referred to, but you don't get any of the details. So that makes it quite, you know, quite an intriguing story to study. But Trimalchio's Feast is actually basically complete. So there's this one episode that is fully there, and it's had a massive impact on certain literature that you'd be familiar with now. Like, for example, The Great Gatsby, heavily inspired by Trimalchio's Feast. In fact, I think a working title for it was Trimalchio at West Egg. I think the character Jay Gatsby lives in this massive house at West Egg. And basically, it's a moment in the text where the main characters end up at this dinner party, which is being held by a guy called Trimalchio. And Trimalchio is what's called a freedman. Famously, Rome was one of the sort of great slave states, we might say, of history. Slavery was hardwired into the economy of ancient Rome, as it was in other cultures. They weren't the only ones who did that, but they had laws concerning slavery and so on. And a freedman is someone who's been granted his freedom by his former owner, and he then has this kind of like status in between. So you've got like a sort of citizen freedman, a normal freeborn citizen there. You've got a freedman here, and you have the slave there, right?
Right.
And the freedman can't do certain things. He's not able to enter the Senate, for example, and really join the elite. But the thing about Trimalchio is that he is fantastically wealthy because he's become a successful businessman, and he's just like he's just basically able to just conjure money out of thin air. He's so rich. And the story is a kind of it's an incredible it's about 40 or 50 pages long, if memory serves, and it's a really fantastic, very weird read. where he's bringing out all of these kind of like fantastical dishes that are posing as other things, and it's a story that in which nothing is quite as it seems, which is also kind of important theme for the story as a whole. So I just wanted to mention that because it would be conspicuous by its absence if I didn't talk a little bit about Trimalchio's feast. But
no,
that's a pretty good summary, I think, of the main points of the story. But if you have any other questions about it, I can certainly try to answer them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I agree that is quite a good. I've sort of got a vision in my head of how the story sort of plays out, and already I can sort of see how there's definitely a lot of humorous points and things to touch on, which that might be sort of a good segue now to speak more about the humor and ways that you've sort of applied that into Satyrica. So what has it been like, first of all, sort of looking at humor more generally, right? Because humor and laughter is a bit of a ambiguous thing. It's quite difficult to put your finger on. So how's that been, looking at it?
Yeah, very good question. So what I would say first of all is that we have a tendency to construe humor and laughter as though they are the same thing, but in fact they're sister subjects that are related, but they're distinct from one another. So if I were to just ask you, Sean, like how would you define laughter if somebody needed a quick definition for whatever reason from you about what laughter is, how would you go about describing it? Because it's actually harder than you might think.
Laughter. Yeah, I mean to me, I go to quite a simple definition of sort of the physical things that I observe when someone laughs, right? So for me, that would be sort of an exhale from the mouth, a smile, and perhaps like a shake of the head. You know what I mean? Something like that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So sort of like kind of some sort of bodily thing that comes from within us, and it's kind of, so I would describe it like that too. It's a somatic thing, which is a bit like a cough or a sneeze or something like that. Yet at the same time, something which has laid on top of it all kinds of other nuances, like there's a social dimension to laughter. You can describe laughter in all kinds of ways that you can't describe other things. You could have a seductive laugh, you could have an evil laugh like the supervillains in the movies or something, but you can't have a seductive cough or whatever. Or at least I've never heard one in my life, but maybe someone is capable of doing that. But anyway, so you have these kind of additional nuances that make laughter quite interesting. But the other thing which is interesting about it is that it's a very subjective thing. Other than like I don't know, like Hans Moleman's football in the groin or something from The Simpsons, there isn't really anything that will mathematically guarantee a uniform reaction from a given audience that will make everyone laugh for the same reasons at the same time 100% of the time. It's a very subjective thing. The reasons why I might laugh at something are different to the reasons why you might laugh at something. If you think about like a stand-up comedy performance, a comedian who comes to mind would be Stuart Lee, just because he's very kind of referential of laughter in the room when it's happening. He's often pointing out, oh, you up there are not laughing as much as these guys down here. You've got up your game up there, or what's going on? Why do they find that more funny than you do? And you're sort of like you're looking then at his comedy on like a more abstract level as it's happening.
Right.
If you're at a stand-up comedy performance and a comedian tells a joke and everyone laughs, when you hear the laughter, that's one thing, but then if you consider the reasons why other people might be laughing, it's another thing. You might be laughing because you found it funny, and that's obviously the main reason why you would laugh, but you might laugh because you feel awkward. Maybe you're on a date or something, you've been brought there by someone who thinks this guy's funny, but you are not really into it, and you just laugh kind of out of politeness or social awkwardness. Or again, somebody like Stuart Lee, you might be thinking, because he's very kind of, I guess, a bit of an elitist comedian, if I could say, that kind of feeds into his audience. So the audience becomes a kind of elitist audience in a way. You know, they want to be seen getting his jokes because there's a prestige attached to it. So they're laughing for this kind of social reason on top of whatever else there might be. So all that to say, Sean, that it's actually quite difficult to kind of take an abstract look at laughter because it's a very subjective thing.
I think Adam, it's quite interesting as you're saying that. To me, that I think you sort of alluded to it earlier, but to me, then there's quite a difference between sort of laughter and humor, right? Where then humor is a little bit more difficult to pin down. Sort of what causes humor, as you said, it's a bit more subjective. It's a bit more nuanced to it. So you know, what have you found looking at humor more generally? Are there ways that we can look at it and sort of think, oh, that's quite interesting? I don't know.
Well, okay, so you don't necessarily have to laugh you might not laugh in response to something funny. Laughter can result from non-humorous things. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, you know, if somebody tickles you, it's not witty or you know, kind of like
mostly annoying.
Well, yeah, exactly. And you know, it might make you laugh, but it's because of some kind of like physical stimulus that's happening. And if you watch someone being tickled, you don't feel like you're being tickled. It's not something that translates in the same way that a joke might get people laughing. Or laughing gas, for example, which is in the news at the moment for some reason. I think they're banning it.
Interesting.
That's that's you know, that's something that kind of sparks like a chemical reaction that makes you laugh. But is that laughter the same thing as, you know, your appreciation of you know, The Office or something? I don't know. So I guess, yeah, your question is an interesting one because it strikes at an interesting kind of area regarding the theory of laughter. I can maybe just explain a little bit about some theories of laughter which would make this a bit clearer. You got some, so in the classical world there were a few people who were thinking about laughter. In fact, they seem to think more about it than we tend to. The main one would be Aristotle. He argues that laughter is like always an expression of superiority over another person. So like the German word Schadenfreude comes to mind here, which is when you laugh or kind of enjoy the suffering of another person. When I was living in Germany, actually, I was in the queue at the supermarket, and I first found out that Boris Johnson had contracted coronavirus because a lady behind me had received a notification on her phone and she started laughing about it. And, you know, I was kind of like, oh, great, okay, so the whole, you know, Britain is about to explode. I guess that's quite funny. But that was like a kind of pure example of Schadenfreude happening there. And I guess that's kind of a form of that sort of superior laughter. Mm-hmm. And then you have other voices like the Roman physician Galen. He was interested in like the capacity for monkeys and chimpanzees to imitate us because they found monkeys very funny back then. You know, it's that kind of intersection of they're all but the same as us. They're just this close to being human, but at the same time they're categorically something different, and it's like a kind of collision between those two things that cause laughter to result. Apparently, if you were to go to the zoo a few decades ago, you might see like a chimpanzee's tea party where they dressed up monkeys in like 3-piece suits and things and made them do, you know, like sit with cutlery and things, and it's like that kind of ridiculous image of a sort of impersonation of humanity that makes us laugh. And I guess Trimalchio, who I just mentioned, in a way, part of the humor behind that story is that he's like impersonating his betters, his social betters, and he's this close to being one of them, but he can never be. He's as different from them as a monkey is from a human being, which is a cruel way of interpreting that story, but it's definitely something that you you could have thought at the time. And then, you got the likes of Cicero. He was a very famous orator and he's got a reputation now for being quite boring, but actually he was always joking and regarded as quite a funny man. And he wrote about the sort of advantages and the risks of using humour when you are orating, because there is the power for laughter to rebound back on you. You can become a figure of ridicule rather than someone who is funny. So it's the difference between someone laughing with you or someone laughing at you. Back then, you used to be able to, like a kind of accepted debating tactic would be to mimic your opponent. And that could include like the sound of their voice or their facial expressions, which seems kind of like playground sort of childishness to us these days. But it could be kind of an effective way of demeaning your opponent. Back then, however, it could rebound on you and you might end up just making yourself look a bit stupid.
Right.
Sorry, go on.
I'm also sort of interested in, as you're speaking about these different theories, I'm assuming, although I'm not sure, that they're sort of coming at different times in culture and times in human history, right? So have you found that there's sort of, along with the times, the humor of sort of the average person changes or do you think there are always sort of underlying things that people find funny? And I guess that's what the theories are trying to point at, right? But, I'm sort of thinking nowadays, I don't know if we would find the same things as humorous or if there'd be a bit more sort of variation there.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, are we laughing at the same things as the ancients were laughing at if we read one of these texts and we find it funny? Yeah, I totally get the question. It's something that is... it's quite difficult to interpret, to be honest, because there are certain moments that you can read about which just, they're so relatable that you get the impression that the ancients were really just exactly the same as us, but just living in a different time period. So like the Roman historian Cassius Dio, he's at the arena and he's watching the Emperor Commodus playing the gladiator. So this is the emperor who's depicted in the movie Gladiator, who's always like kind of, trying to pose as a gladiator, and he's fighting in the arena at one point. He kills 2 ostriches, I think it is, in the arena, and then he like holds up their heads like this, and he has like a crazy face. And what you have to remember is that gladiators are lower than slaves. They're just like they're the lowest class that you can get. They're part of this strata that I think includes actors and what we would call sex workers, but Romans would use a more derogatory term for. Gladiators were part of that. So seeing the emperor who's capable of being perceived as a god in certain ways in the arena is like this topsy-turvy image that's quite hard for a normal Roman to compute. And the historian Dio is watching and he feels this urge kind of like bubble up within him of laughter taking over his body. And it really, for all the world, it just reminds you of being at school and, the teacher is shouting at you and you're suddenly like, oh my God, why am I laughing? What is so, this isn't funny, but I'm laughing. And then the teacher says, why are you laughing? This is outrageous behavior. And it makes you laugh even more. Like, this is almost like the feeling he's describing when he's watching this. And he has to take some leaves off of he's got a laurel wreath to hand, and he's like, starts chewing on the leaves to hide the fact that he's laughing. And, instead of detention that a teacher would give you for laughing, Commodus is probably going to like execute you if you're laughing at him. So it was quite serious.
A lot higher stakes.
Yeah, exactly. Very high stakes situation. So that's a moment that appears, to be tapping into this like underlying grammar of laughter that is kind of innate within us, which we can recognize. But at the same time, if you were to look at, classical literature is full of stuff that is quite culturally specific and difficult to compute. I last semester was looking at the plays of Terence, for example, who was a Roman playwright. I think it's the 2nd century BC. I can't quite remember, but he wrote comedies, 6 comedies, I think it is, and he has one called The Eunuch. And it's a very complicated, kind of convoluted plot at the center of which is basically the old switcheroo, except the circumstances are basically that there's there's a slave girl, and one of the characters is posing as a eunuch who's been given as a gift to the owner of this slave girl, and he disguises himself as the eunuch so that he can gain access to this slave girl because he's in love with her, and he's then able to basically take her. And this is supposed to be funny, by the way. It's really hard to kind of imagine that this is something that would provoke laughter. And then at the end, they get married, so it's all fine. But another reminder that like the kind of morality of the time is just so different to what we're dealing with. So you've got that, and that's the crux of a comedy, and you're kind of like, okay, I mean, I can't possibly find this funny. I'm not seeing the funny side. Or like, for example, a joke within that, there's a joke within that play, which is told by a character who's a kind of soldier full of bravado, a kind of boring, bragging guy who's constantly trying to get the ladies. And he tells this joke, which is very complicated for a couple of reasons. The joke is, first of all, talking about a Rhodian, which is someone from Rhodes, the island south of Turkey, which was Greek. And, you're sort of like, okay, fine. That's great. I don't know what that means, really, but okay. And on top of that, this joke, at the time that it's in the play, is considered to be a very old joke, right? And he's telling it as if he's invented it. So it's a bit like, if in a modern play someone tells, like, what do you call a deer with no eyes? Oh, no idea. Like, as if he's invented that joke that everyone knows, or one of the jokes you get inside a Christmas cracker or something. Shark infested custard, right? If he comes up with that joke and tries to pass it off as a new creation. So there's that cultural nuance on top of it, but then finally there's also a pun in the Latin that is basically impossible to replicate into an English translation. So the joke that you actually read is totally different to the joke that is in the play.
Right.
And so, yeah, you got to be careful interpreting these texts, certainly as regards humor, because there are all kinds of cultural nuances and kind of time-specific things that make those jokes funny.
Right.
And then all the things that we were just talking about also apply to that joke. Like, if you're in the crowd watching that play and they tell that joke, people will laugh, but they might laugh for different reasons. Again, maybe for some reason you've been living under a rock and it's the first time you're hearing it and you think, oh, that's great, and you start laughing. Or maybe you're laughing because you realize he's telling this really old joke as if it was new. Or maybe and you also get this cultural reference about the guy from Rhodes. So trying to translate all of that baggage into English, into our own time, and then also bearing in mind kind of complicated sexual morals that might govern plot points and things, it means that you have to be really careful interpreting the humor.
Yeah, definitely.
There is one further thing I would say about this. Another problem with these texts is that laughter vocabulary in Latin is actually very sparse. The verb is ridere, which means to laugh, and you've got that verb and you've got its kind of cognates, all the words that are connected to it, and then you would have cacchinare, which means to cackle. It's an onomatopoeic word. You can sort of hear how that means cackle, but that's pretty much it really in terms of like what you can work with. Whereas in English, you've got chortle, titter, chuckle, laugh, giggle, snigger, so many different words that you can use to describe laughter that will be appropriate in one context or another. But in the Latin, you've only got like a few options. So you're taking liberties when you're making translations, and choosing from the range of vocabulary that we have in English to fit the context. And again, that has the potential to change the way you're understanding it in a way that might bring it further away from the authentic text itself, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I guess in answer to your question about, you know, different time periods, certainly compared to our own, there are all kinds of reasons why it's hard to work with, but it's really interesting because all of these little nuances are you know, they're fun to sort of roll up your sleeves and kind of get into.
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned, laughter is it's especially interesting because there are so many different layers of things to consider, right? And I guess that's I'm thinking, wow, you know, if I was to think about humor in a more academic sense and sort of apply it to a text, you know, the way you're speaking now, it's like I feel like there's a million different directions that you can go in and sort of consider. So, you know, how's that been then trying to apply that into Satirica? Has that been quite difficult? Have you sort of been able to um, do that in a manner that, you know, that you find interesting and that you think sort of can help highlight some things that perhaps people haven't thought about before?
Yeah. So I don't think I mentioned before there are these three theories of laughter, quote unquote, right? I was talking earlier about kind of ancient voices regarding laughter, but there have been further attempts to try to like pin it down. So you imagine like laughter as like a butterfly, and you've got a net, so you try and like wheak it out of the air and put it under a perspex box. Theorizing about laughter is kind of a bit like that. And so the first one would be the superiority theory, which we already kind of mentioned with Aristotle. You've also got a relief theory of laughter, so that would be kind of like gallows humor. If you think of, you know, maybe like joking culture during the Soviet Union under Stalin's regime or something, you know, jokes about not being able to tell jokes, or kind of jokes about censorship, like that are comically redacted or something. Or like, you know, there's that joke from the Troubles about men in balaclavas pulling you into an alley and asking, are you a Catholic or are you a Protestant? And you say, I'm an atheist. And they say, okay, are you a Catholic atheist or are you a Protestant atheist? You know, it's a kind of laugh in the face of this thing that's causing a lot of tension and anxiety. Freud is the thinker who's most associated with that. He would describe it as like a sort of, you know, like a repression of psychic energy that you would use to kind of push the fear away, coming out as a form of laughter. And then you have incongruity. So that's like when you laugh at something you're not expecting. The laughter that's at the root of puns and that sort of thing. I think it was Gordon Strachan, when he was the Celtic manager, he signed a player called Jan Verreguur of Hesselink. And when he was asked about the signing, he said, they said, are you happy with that signing? And he said, yes, I've signed one of the biggest names in world football. He was quite good with those kinds of quips. So, you know, your mind is expecting the comment to relate to his stature as a player, but actually it's about the length of the guy's surname. So those are kinds of theories that have been, I mean, the very reductive forms of theories. I mean, I'm just giving you a sort of sense of them, that have kind of evolved to try and break open the debate and like give you a starting point, a kind of foothold in how you would look at it. The problem with theories is that they're kind of, they contradict one another and they contradict themselves at a certain point too. So if you're taking the superiority theory and you're saying, okay, all the laughter in the Satyrica is an example of laughter as a form of superiority. The problem that you're going to have is you're going to find some examples that fit that mold, but you're probably going to have more examples of laughter in the text that don't actually fit that mold. So you either end up kind of like with a half convincing theory, or you end up warping what's there in the text to kind of reverse engineer it back into the theory, and then that's not really a convincing answer. And recently, some scholars, Mary Beard being one, you know, a pretty famous classicist in the public eye, and another one would be Stephen Halliwell, who actually he was recently, until recently, was working at St Andrews. I think he's retired now. They've written works on laughter in antiquity. Mary Beard wrote Laughter in Ancient Rome. Halliwell wrote Greek Laughter. And what they're doing is kind of looking at laughter. If you think of the theories I've just mentioned as almost kind of like looking at laughter through the wrong end of a telescope. They just kind of like flip the telescope back round, and then you have like a much broader perspective of laughter in the ancient world. And they do that by basically bringing in all kinds of different evidence, medical evidence, anecdotal evidence, historical stuff, things from literature, in some cases like legal documentation, and it's basically like kind of shining light on the phenomenon of laughter from as many different directions as you can to give you just this more general kind of eclectic view of the concept. So what I would do with laughter in the text of the Satyrica is just kind of, I would simply be looking to analyze it on its own terms, and basically, not go into it with any preconceived notions about what I'm going to find. I'm not too interested in adopting one of these specific theoretical approaches to laughter. I'll be looking at it in terms of a kind of more eclectic approach after the fashion of Beard and Halliwell, and just building up a kind of organic picture of that concept as it manifests, and see kind of what happens, really. You can have all kinds of different interpretations of laughter. I mean, there was a movie made of the Satyrica, which is fantastic, and it's on YouTube now, and it's really well worth watching. It was made by Fellini back in the 60s, and it's in color and everything. And it's called the Fellini Satyricon. He wanted to call it the Satyricon, but the problem was that a pornography had already been made of this book, and they had called it the Satyricon. So for for copyright reasons, he couldn't do that.
They beat him to the punch.
Yeah, exactly. And in his film adaptation of the text, laughter is a very sinister thing. It's contributing to this sense of confusion. If you think of laughter almost like what you might hear on a ghost train or something, this like cackling, weird, unsettling laughter that is off to the side. He's got like little old crones with veils over their heads, kind of like cackling in the doorways and things. Or there's a moment where Ascyltos is on this swing, and he's going back and forth like this, and there's like loads of ladies kind of on the floor, like looking up at him because he's a kind of sex god guy, and the camera's like panning in right on his face, and he's laughing for him in joy, but there's this sinister edge to this laughter because you're seeing it through the jealous eyes of Encolpius. So for Fellini, the laughter is something in the text that contributes to this sinister darkness, but there are other ways you could look at it that might, you might suggest that it's life-affirming and socially uplifting, and it's all kind of carnivalesque and good-natured. So it's kind of up to you, really. I mean, as long as you can justify what you're saying by the text, you can make any sort of argument, I would say. So,
right,
I mean, what I'm saying is I'm making a cop-out. I don't have a view on this, John.
Well, no, I think you do, because I think that's the argument, right? The argument is that you can't really pin down humor or laughter under one theory. I think that's the argument, right? The argument is more, it's impossible. So it's better just to sort of let it be natural and let it sort of exist by itself. I think something I find would be interesting from your personal point of view, right? It's if you're sort of studying humor, studying laughter, does that for you, say if you now watch stand-up comedy show or like humorous TV shows, is it hard for you to sort of turn off that academic brain thinking like, oh, what theory is this? Like, are you still able to enjoy humor, or does it sort of like take away from it?
Oh, a little bit, I guess. Yeah. I mean, yeah. There's a moment actually. I gave a presentation in class recently, and I wanted to show a clip from the Office. Are you familiar with the original version of The Office?
Oh. I've begun watching it, but I haven't got too far into it.
Well, there's a brilliant moment which I won't spoil too much for you, but David Brent basically does this motivational speaking evening. He's contacted by these industry professionals, and they ask him to be a motivational speaker. And because he's quite a fallible person, his ego is tickled, and he does it. But he's terrible, and he closes his presentation by basically says, I try to laugh several times a day just because it makes you feel good. And I think we should all laugh together now. Why don't we all just try it? And then he starts laughing himself for no reason. And the more he does it, the more carried away he gets. But the people who are watching him are like horrified because it's so embarrassing, and they're all totally stone dead quiet. And you get the sense that like Ricky Gervais himself just kind of like David Brent kind of melts away, and then Ricky Gervais is just standing there laughing, and the camera pans in on Dawn, because Dawn, the receptionist, is sitting there, and the camera just pans in on her, and she's narrating, and she says, I'd be lying if I said that my life had turned out the way I thought it was going to. And meanwhile, David Brent is just like cackling madly in the background. And, you know, like for me now, having looked at all this stuff about laughter, I can see that in a new way. And you can definitely see, all kinds of other examples of laughter that way. So it is a blessing and a curse, I suppose, but that's just kind of what happens when you study literature.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks, Adam. I think that might be a pretty good place to end it. Unless, do you have any other sort of points that you'd like to touch on, or before we sort of put a cap on this?
I think I'm good, to be honest, Sean. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I think that's probably enough to pique the interest of any listeners who might be curious.
Oh,
about
definitely.
it.
I thought, yeah.
But I came across the Satyrica just by reading one of Mary Beard's books, and I'd never heard of it before, and I thought, wow, that sounds like a really interesting and completely wacky text. So it kind of started my journey from there. So, if there are others listening who for whom laughter might serve as a useful lens in whatever they're doing, I would imagine that it could have all kinds of other applications, not just within literature. Then that would be great. So good luck to anyone who wants to try that, I guess.
Great. Well, yeah. Thank you very much for your time, Adam, and thanks for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you for having me, Sean. Nice talking.
Cheers.
All right.